This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.
Oh, hello. Do we have Lance Lambert on the phone? I apologise for that's the worst British accent you've ever heard.
Actually, that was quite smart. I'm impressed. I don't think I've ever had a Canadian friend give a Brit accent impersonation. That's great.
Maybe this would be the last one. The only thing I know is go blow your bloody nose. No, oh, geez. How you doing in the UK? I just know that when you're there for a long time, you have family from there, you start talking like you're from there. Has that happened to you yet?
A little bit. It has. I won't lie. I got to catch up with a few good friends that fortunately are in the industry as well on this side of the pond, as they say. So, yeah, it does kind of rub off on you after a little bit of time here, that's for sure.
This side of the pond, you say. So how are things in the land on that, the UK there, where you think of the Queen and things being so prim and proper? Are they accepting the cannabis flower?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, they did legalize, as much as I was surprised. And I knew that when Canada legalized, some of the Commonwealth countries would pay attention to that, but was quite surprised that the mother country herself came around just 2 weeks after you all legalized adult use, which we all know was October 17th of 2018. Literally November 1st. England actually announced that they were launching a medical program. And so that was a topic of discussion. We were on a networking cruise this evening on the River Times, and we were catching up with some industry folks thanks to the people at Product Earth Expo and Emerald Cup that are putting on the event this weekend. And they said, "Oh, Lance, yeah, it's still not going to happen for another 3 to 5 years." I said, "Well, that's what I was thinking at first, but when they announced it right after Canada came online, I thought for sure they were going to get committed within the next year or two, and they're like, oh, no, politics. Politics, my dear friend." So it sounds like the medical program is a little ways out here in England specifically, but I'm happy to say the Republic of Ireland is on track to get on board sooner than later, and likewise France as well with their beta program, as they consider it, for medical. So things are looking up here for certain.
Oh, that's great to hear, and it sounds like really a lot of progressiveness then.
Yeah, I'd say so. Times have changed. I've seen it over, obviously, the several years that I've been coming out, and it's just a lot more open-mindedness. And just like what we saw in the States, and I think likewise was seen up in Canada, CBD is kind of blazing the trail. It's really, you can find CBD flower here. They sell it by the gram. It's considered legal, evidently, so they're moving forward with at least offering that. Of course, it has to be less than, here I believe it's 2% or lower THC level. But there is CBD. It can be found around, so there's a bit of buzz on that. But yeah, I think they're finally coming along, and looking forward to seeing more.
And what about in terms of sort of the companies and producers and on kind of the business end of things? Are you seeing more and more entrepreneurship within the space out of the UK?
Yeah, definitely. So that was another benefit of the event, the networking event this evening, is the actual now new CEO of Product Earth, who just quit his job at Facebook yesterday, to give you an idea of where people are coming from, which is all different corners of industries to this industry. They're doing some things above and beyond this trade show, this B2B and B2C event this weekend. They also do other things. So kind of similar to Lyft up by you or MJ Biz down in the States. They've got some other hands in the pot, so to speak. But a lot of people don't know that GW Pharmaceuticals is based out of England, and they are technically the larger exporter of medical cannabis in the world. So it's interesting that England's not a stranger to the plant, let alone the production and the profits from it. So I think that is going to play kind of an influence on the grand scheme of things. And that's what Friend said, again, catching up with them, was that it's going to go, unfortunately, kind of mainstream, big corporate, and then boutique. So it sounds like it's going to be a little similar to breweries, where you're going to have the macro, micro of the both sides to the business. So we'll see how it pans out for certain.
Yeah, macro, micro. One of the things, that they sort of legalized in Canada, part of the legalization of cannabis, was that you could have sort of 4 plants per household. Are you hearing more and more people
doing real kind of micro kind of stuff, meaning their own? Like a lot of people sort of exploring and trying to grow and understanding. Do you catch wind of that stuff?
Yeah, that's definitely something, Todd. I know we haven't discussed too much, but that is really, when you go into the international space, and the UK is no exception to this rule, hydro, or what we call hydroponics, hydro for short, and that whole aspect of the horticulture of the plant is actually very dominant. And it's something you see across Europe, but you also see in South America, where that's the main focus for people that are in the industry, because head shops and smoke shops aren't quite the norm as they are in North America. So the event that I was at last weekend out in the countryside was put on by Autopot, a great organization. They have their own product for the industry. And that was all focused on trade only, as they say. So it was B2B, and a lot of the folks that we caught up with and interacted with owned hydro shops. And our product obviously does well in those, because those that grow know that Boveda works and it's the way to go. So we got to hear from them, and they said more and more people are buying the small tent operations, to your point, to do 1, 2, maybe 3 plants. A lot of people are doing underground grows. And again, this is something you see in markets, especially leading up to legalization. So it's just as common here as it is, again, visiting South America or Australia or any other part of Europe for that matter.
Are people more likely in certain nations then willing to kind of explore the growth aspect? And is there a sort of a theme there? Like, when I think of Europeans, I think there's a lot more microbrews, at least started there, and a lot of people doing home brews and even doing your own wines. Like they're kind of, at least maybe I'm stereotyping here, but it seems like a little more cultured and experimental than Canadians anyway. I'm not sure about Americans.
No, I agree with you. While I think both of us have friends that do the home craft brew and such, and some friends that grow, I think that is an exception to the rule in North America. I'm not saying we're lazy, but I'd say that
no, we're lazy.
Much respected. It's not as much respected as a craft. So you do hear the people over here talking about the genetics and talking about living soil and really getting into it and geeking it out. And it's something that isn't uncommon. You go on the countryside. I remember I was out in Gloucester, which is a little township, just a few hours outside of Paddington by train. And you go to the local pub, and literally the brews, they're all cask, which a lot of people think that's room temperature. It's actually cellar temperature. So it's, 14, 15 C. It's not cold, but it's decent. And a lot of those are actually produced by farmers. They brew their own beer in off season, and then they supply the local pubs. And so I think that just kind of shows how much they embrace, working the land and technically living off the land. And that's not segregated just to wheat and hops and potatoes by any means.
It's interesting when I think of the UK, I think of maybe specific like beers that way. You think of a stronger hoppy. Is it that same way in cannabis for them? Do they have a specific strain and things they like?
They do. So this is something that I've been studying.
I'm asking good questions, say Lance Lambert from bovedainc.com.
Funny you ask that. So one thing that's fascinated me is that the Europeans are very much in love with their hazes, as we say. So you have super silver haze, lemon haze, amnesia haze. These are all cannabis strains that are very heady, like very much more so leaning towards the sativa or the awake, the alert side than, say, something sleepy or an indica like Blue Dream or something more relaxed, like Skittles. So it is interesting that they're appreciative of certain strains. But what's interesting is when you talk about land-raised strains like, Acapulco Gold or Northern Lights or even Durban Poison, which came out of Africa, of course, or Thai Stick, which came out of Thailand, there's not necessarily a strain that's synonymous dating back to the land-raised strains with this area. But having said that, they've definitely landed on the ones they like, and you can find them quite commonly when you go to places that you're allowed to purchase, like Amsterdam and Holland or down in Barcelona, Spain.
And what's it like for transporting cannabis in Europe? Is that also a tricky thing? People sort of get nervous still. You can fly with it from what I understand in Canada, but you got to kind of declare when you land. LA, we've talked about in the past, has allowed you to fly out of LAX with it. Obviously you want to be going to a legal state. Yeah. How are people feeling about transporting it?
they're still very apprehensive because you're right. For us in North America, both where you are and where I am, I think are the most open on allowing the transportation for personal consumption, of course. And so that is something that people here are a bit apprehensive about. Security doesn't seem quite as tight, ironically, because there is the issue of terrorism, which has been more predominant in the UK as of late. But I would say the security didn't seem any heavier than it normally is in the airport. I didn't see any dogs this time, so I'm not sure when people do transport their feelings on it. But I'd say that a lot are still apprehensive. Again, with seeing CBD flower out in the market, that's one thing that comes to mind. When all of a sudden CBD flower is present, all of a sudden it's like, well, what I'm carrying could be CBD. But again, I think it's still because it's in that shady area. A lot of stuff gets transported also. I don't think we've talked about this, but, the Parliament over, to pick on Amsterdam for a minute, since they're kind of known for being the destination for consumption in Europe, they really tried to combat cannabis there, and subsequently a large portion of what's consumed there has been getting transported up from Spain and even from Portugal. So they have to, of course, pass through France to do that. So France has beefed up their security and inspection points. But it is interesting that this product is getting transported, currently in the illicit market. And then if you think about, again, companies like GW Pharmaceuticals, they're legitimate medical producers. They're also being transported in large quantities legitimately as well, through specifically England.
Lance Lambert, talking everything to do with sort of cannabis and what's going on in the UK and abroad. And I love learning about this. One of the things I was reading, also knowing that you were there, was basically what we've talked about many, many different times about how, when you do legalize this drug, it's going to create tons of revenues and tax dollars. And one campaigner, I think his name was the Snowden, but not the Snowden we know, talked about how it would raise $1 billion for the UK in tax revenues. And I think a lot of countries could use these $1 billion in tax revenues right now. When people start to talk about it in those sort of terms, does that help expedite it to make it completely legal?
I think it does. For me, I'm an advocate for the plant from a medical standpoint, and it's more about the plant than the profit. But having said that, we do know that that's a lever that is oftentimes pulled in order to get things expedited. It's what happened in Colorado, as much as Hickenlooper, who now is running for president, and all of a sudden is pro, who was very much anti back in the day for legalization of cannabis. But it was the money, it was the financial gain that really opened his eyes to seeing the potential and being a little bit more liberal towards the plant. So I do think that's a factor here. In talking to an individual who does work for a company in the cannabis industry here, I asked him, I said, do people ask where you work, what you do? And he's like, well, I'm more so on the logistics side. But it is still a bit taboo to talk about here. He's all, unlike if people ask you and you tell them and they start asking you about, their ailments and how cannabis maybe could help them. He's all, that's not the conversations we really have here. He's all, matter of fact, I kind of try to avoid it still just because of that stigma associated. And I think it goes back, not to pick on the UK in general, like you said, but they've been known for being a bit more conservative, a bit of a traditionalist. I mean, this is, you guys are a Commonwealth country, but this is home of the Queen, and it's just a little different ideology. But they do very much love it here, is one thing I've learned quickly in the last week with my conversations. Lance
Lambert, aside from everything going on in the space, let's talk a little bit about your company. Tell us about the Boveda Butler.
Oh my gosh. I know I should have shared that with you sooner. So this is a product that we had originally had created for the cigar industry because oftentimes individuals want to know what the relative humidity and ambient temperature is in their humidors when they're not around them. And so we literally came up with a solution. It's a small sensor that as of last week, you can now purchase on Amazon, but you can also purchase on our site. And it can obviously be used in the cannabis industry as well, because we want to know that same information. But you get this little sensor and you put it in your humidor or you put it in your stash jar or your medical jar. And there's an app that syncs up with it. And via the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi within your home, you're able to access and see what the actual relative humidity and ambient temperature is in your humidor or stash. And I got to tell you, I've been using one for several months, and I absolutely love it. It's great to know that it's safe. It also has a bit of a knock sensor in it, an alert. So it does alert you if someone touches your humidor or touches your stash jar, which is a nice feature as well, all the way down to the fact that you can just order and re-up your supply for Boveda by the click of a button. So, some technology that we delve into, and very proud to make it available to all markets now.
Man, I love to hear when tech sort of gets combined with some of the oldest things in the planet. Like, it's really wild. Right. So what would desired humidity rates be?
So, it comes down to personal preference. The two primary ones that we focus on for the cannabis industry is 58% relative humidity and 62%. So when you're, not to geek out, but when you're growing, you pull down the plant, you bucket, and you dry it. And then when you're curing it, you typically most cure it around 55%, maybe a little less, a little more. So the 58% is popular to fine-tune the cure and to do long-term storage. 62% is a bit more moisture. Some people prefer that, especially on the medical side. If you're using a dry herb vaporizer, maybe something like, the G-Pen or the Firefly. And so when you're actually herbalizing and atomizing the flower within those devices, to have a little extra moisture helps. You get one or two additional drags from it. But again, it's all preference, and both of them are available on our sites or on Amazon as well.
Man, that's really neat to hear, and now to relate it on the sort of the bigger grow up licensed LP side of things. This is what part of the reason why you've heard stories or rumors of stories anyway that some of these larger LPs are having difficulty growing mass amounts of cannabis because of that humidity level. Is that a big part of it? Where you hear it about dried flower often.
Yeah, you do. And you know what? This isn't something you can scale up. And I've been saying this for years, but you truly can't scale up cannabis like you can soybeans or corn. It's just not the same as far as many other plants out there that are very easy to just add another hectare, add another acre of land and launch off. It really is quite a drastic scale when you start getting into size. So temperature, airflow, all of that matters while you're actually growing. It also happens to matter post-harvest when you're drying and curing, but it is really tough for them to keep control of it. And a lot do err on the side of caution and keep their flower drier, because obviously the drier it is, the lower risk of potentials of mold and microbial growth. But again, that danger zone doesn't happen until 65%. So these numbers we're seeing where these growers, especially up in Canada, are keeping their flower around 35, 40%, that's really a disservice to the consumer, because that's when you get trichome fatigue, where the trichomes dry out. And that's where obviously a lot of magic happens in the plant as far as those trichomes hold the terpenes, the flavonoids. They really help contribute to the entourage effect, but also the end user's experience. If it's too dry, it rips your throat, it can use your joints. It really makes the overall experience for the end user, whether it be a medical patient or adult recreational use, really kind of takes away from it. So it is a bit sad that some are still figuring out how to get that perfect quality product out the door up there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's part of these, no pun intended here, but growing pains. And that to me is going to be one of the most interesting things within the cannabis sector over the next sort of 5 years anyway, is that who ultimately will win out, and especially for publicly traded companies, as the best premier growers of the product. And will it actually go away from the LPs, and will it just be stuck to, the ones that do it best, which you mentioned, like farmer, people who understand crops, crop seasons, humidity drops from weather changes, all this kind of stuff. Are people trying to do too much too soon? And, I think we're seeing a reflection in a lot of share prices these days too. Yeah,
very much so. And there's definitely been some issues as of late in that space. But I do agree. I think we don't like to compare it to alcohol, but in fairness, it will, again, it's going back to the micro-macro. You have, to your point, those boutique growers, and it sounds crazy, but just like a bottle of wine or that fine-crafted beer, there's something about the taste and the experience when there's been love put in the production of that product. These small-scale series or that one limited edition from that 1 year that this Merlot was produced on the mountainside of Napa, whatever the case, it still really does make a difference in the experience for the end user. So I think it is going to go that direction. And the big guys will continue to be the Walmarts and Targets and all the rest of it. And the smaller guys will be obviously the more boutique shops.
You know, Lance, that's why I never liked my orgies. There was too much going on. I just like to be in my monogamous, healthy relationship, and you know, that's where you know, we touched it, we had the love, and it always ended up, you know, tasting better. Sorry, I don't know.
Yes.
I'm on kind of vacation here. Give me a break, man. Oh, dude. Well, listen, safe travels home from the UK. So happy to catch up and hear about your experiences over there. We look forward to catching up with you, of course, next week on the program, as we always do, from bovedainc.com, at Boveda Cannabis. Give them a follow. Again, they don't touch the plant, but as you know from Lance and everything they do with their team, they are the global leaders in humidity control, and that's something that I think you all want. So, man, cheers again. We do appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Todd. Cheers. Have a good night.
Okay, cheers. Lance Lambert.
This is the Todd Shapiro Show on Canada Talks, SiriusXM 167.